talk organized by the Cátedra UNESCO de Derechos Humanos de la Universidad de la República. This is part of our series on the 50th commemoration of the dictatorship in Uruguay and also the resistance. And we have the honor today to have Professor Ruth Wodak. So as I was saying, we are very delighted to have Ruth Wodak, and we are lucky that she could connect to be with us, joining us from Vienna. And
hello.
Yes, hello, Ruth. Thanks
Hi.
for being here. And we're very lucky also to have the students and the director of the interpreting and translation licenciatura of the University of La República in Uruguay doing the interpreting. So today, for those of you who are joining us through YouTube, we have a channel in Spanish and we have one in English, so you can see the talk in your language, your preferred language, right? So we have Federico Brum, who will be interpreting. He's the coordinator of the career, the licenciatura in translation. We also have Victoria Zavala, Celine Rueda, Ion Intrioni, Indira Alvarez, Guillermo Gil, and we have the technical assistance of Leroy, who is joining us and making all this possible.
Thank
so
you.
For those of you joining us through YouTube, we'll have the chance to have your comments and questions through the chat, so please use that. And first, I'll take a few minutes to introduce Ruth Wodak. For those of you who don't know all of her work, I mean, she's very prolific and she's one of the reference in critical discourse analyses. So we're very thankful for her to be here with us today. Ruth Wodak is Emerita Distinguished Professor of Discourse Studies at Lancaster University in the UK and is also affiliated to the University of Vienna. Besides various other prizes, she was awarded the Wittgenstein Prize for Elite Researchers in 1996 and an honorary doctorate from the University of Örebro in Sweden in 2010, and an honorary doctorate from Warwick University in 2020. She's also past president of the Societas Linguistica Europea, and in 2011, she was awarded the Grand Decoration of Honor in Silver for services to the Republic of Austria. In 2018, the Lebenswerk Prize for her lifetime achievements from the Austrian Ministry for Women's Affairs. And she's also a member of the British Academy of Social Sciences and a member of the Academia Europea. In March 2020, she became honorary member of the Senate of the University of Vienna. And in June 2021, she was awarded the Bruno Kreisky Prize for her lifetime achievements. In November 2022, she received the Paul Václavík Energy. I'm sorry, I'm not pronouncing it correctly, I'm sorry, of the Medical Society and CD of Vienna. And in addition, she's also been in service to the profession through her membership in editorial boards of a range of linguistic journals and the co-editor of journals like Discourse and Society, Critical Discourse Studies, and Language and Politics. In addition, Ruth has published 12 monographs, 29 co-author monographs, and over 60 edited volumes and special journals, and more than 420 peer-reviewed journal papers and book chapters. Her recent book publications include Identity Politics, Past and Present, Political Discourses from Post-War Austria to the COVID Crisis, which was published in 2022 with Michael Weindorf, and The Politics of Fear, the Shameless Normalization of Far-Right Populist Discourses in 2021. I think this last book is very relevant to us in Latin America at this moment, so it would be great if we could have it in Spanish soon. So without much more comments, I pass the the microphone to Ruth, and thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you very much, Mariana, for inviting me. I'm really delighted to participate, even if it's from far away, but Zoom makes everything possible. And that at least is one good result of the pandemic, that we have learned to share globally online, which we didn't do as much before. We did have some Skypes and so forth, but not all these technical possibilities. And I'm really also delighted to be able to share our work, which also draws on a lot on your work. So it's fantastic to discuss various theories and methodologies with you as well, as we have had common interests for such a long time. And especially at this time, as you mentioned, with the 50-year commemoration of the dictatorship, we just briefly talked about various developments in Europe and in the Americas, with far-right populism on the rise. And I think the ongoing dehistorization is very dangerous, because if people would remember more what had happened not so long ago, maybe some of the things wouldn't happen which are unfortunately happening. So if I may share my PowerPoint now, I will try and find it. This seems to be it. No, this is not it. Wait a second. I don't know where it oh, here it is. I have to press here. Why is this different now than it was before?
I don't know. If you haven't changed, I have it, so I can post it.
Wait,
now it's working.
Yeah. Yeah. Now it is.
Okay.
Now it's here. And I will. So what I'm going to talk about today is, I think, a theme which you will probably recognize also from Uruguay and also other countries. I have a very good colleague who's working on Chile, and of course there are many other people working on Argentina, and basically every country, I believe, has some skeletons in their cupboard, and are forced to confront these skeletons in different ways. But it's difficult, and it comes up time and again. And then there's again sort of a gap. And commemorations are important because at least they allow for various events and speeches and so forth. But of course, sometimes they only remain rituals. And in that way, rituals are important, but we must work for a more continuous remembrance, and also be aware how this links to our everyday lives in the present. So what I will talk about today is very much about Austria, but you can certainly generalize a lot to other countries, especially in the theoretical framework. And I do hope you can also link to the examples which I will give you. I must add at the very beginning that I have worked with teams on all the projects which I will introduce, very much with Markus Reindorf, who you already mentioned as co-author of our most recent book, but also with other psychiatrists, historians, sociopsychologists, so very much always in interdisciplinary teams, because this is such a complex topic that it is very difficult only to cope with it from a purely linguistic, discursive point of view. So if it's possible, I do endorse teamwork. I endorse interdisciplinarity, problem-oriented disciplinarity, because it allows for a much more triangulated approach from different perspectives and also different data. And I will come back to that shortly. So the overview of my lecture today is, first I will introduce some theoretical concepts which I believe you are all familiar with, but nevertheless I will briefly introduce some, also about the politics of the past and what that means for identity politics, because all our countries are built on certain myths of the past, founding myths. And of course, there are also different narratives, which sometimes are absolutely struggling for hegemony, left and right, old and new, conservative, progressive, whatever. And it's important to be aware of the way identity politics are constructed and not just essentialized. I will then move to the Austrian post-war context, which I guess is probably quite unfamiliar with you. But as I said, I think you can learn a lot from this Austrian context, because Austria was once a monarchy, part of a large monarchy, then democracy and republic, then it was fascist, then it became part of the German Reich, and after 45 it was again is a democracy. And in that way, we have a lot of memory politics. You are certainly also aware that many Austrians were perpetrators in the Holocaust at very important, unfortunately, positions, like Eichmann and Hitler were Austrians. And in that way, the coping with the past was certainly a very difficult job, and it hasn't finished at all. Yeah, it's an ongoing process. I will then talk about my data. I have assembled extracts from various biographical interviews and group discussions with different generations in order to see if there's a continuity of memories and remembrance, and in what way generational differences appear. I know that Mariana has done work with families. We did a bit of work with families, but we also did some focus groups. And in that way, we were able to sort of form such a longitudinal perspective. Of course, there's many discursive strategies and pragmatic elements which we could look at, and I will focus on only a few. On silence, which is also a strategy, denial and legitimation, chronotopes and responsibility, and meta comments on different levels, such as irony, sarcasm, even jokes, which form part and parcel of ways of coping with difficult pasts. And then we can discuss some conclusions. So to start out with the theoretical framework, we drew on very different theories and approaches on individual memory. There is a lot in sociopsychology and cognitive science. Just want to mention Kandel or Schachter, on psychiatrists, about trauma and repression. It is always difficult to transfer psychoanalytic or psychological concepts into the social sciences and into sort of this kind of data. But some of the concepts have just gained salience, like trauma. Yeah. And I think we basically have to use certain concepts, but although they have different meanings in different fields, and it's difficult to transfer them and not really change meanings. There is a lot of work also by Teun van Dijk on knowledge and episodic and long-term memories. So I think that this field is very important, how you deal with these individual memories as such, because we, of course, cannot prove and establish if they're true. We can only rely on these subjective memories. And of course, we can look at the context, which I will discuss later. The context is very important in our framework of the discourse historical approach. But nevertheless, it remains basically impossible to really prove that some of the memories are true or false or whatever. Secondly, we rely on approaches to collective memory. And there are, again, very many different approaches. I believe that Halbwachs has done very important work, same as Aleida Assmann, a German cultural theorist. And in these frameworks, it is important to study culturally shared memories. Now, those are usually those which are official and hegemonic and also repeated by the media and at these ritualized events. And every country has tried to construct such a shared past. There are usually series and documentaries and all kinds of different genres which try to construct and establish this shared past. But then again, it is also challenged. And I will talk about such interventions, two of which were quite recent in the post-war Austrian history. Now, coming to the linguistic dimension, discursive linguistic, the role of narratives is, of course, important, especially when looking at the individual memories. How do you actually tell other people about what you remember? Well, you use narratives, yeah? And on the one hand, there is the function as mediating memory in family histories. So what is referred from one generation to the next, those become like really very important slots or stones in those families to which they refer. And then we elicit stories as an object of analysis. And here I draw a lot on Mariana's work, on Anna Defina's work, and of course also Bakhtin. I will talk later on the concept of chronotope, which Markus Reindorf and I really used a lot in one of those studies, where there are several papers also published. And then there is the huge field of narratology, about how do we define if something is authentic, what are the story schemas and scripts, and there's from Labov-Waletsky to Defina to Greimas, to Vladimir Prop, there are so many different approaches which, of course, I cannot go into, but which is important to know. There are different ways of analyzing these narratives. And so let me start with a quote which I like a lot by Reinhard Koselleck, who was an important historian, conceptual historian, who really wrote a lot about important concepts during history and tried to define their trajectory through centuries. And he said, even if language may at times have been only a secondary factor in the process of action and suffering, as soon as an event becomes part of the past, language becomes the primary factor without which no memory and no scientific transposition of this memory is possible. And that really tells us and shows us that, of course, historians are perfectly aware that they can only access history via language, if it's sources, if it's biographies, autobiographies, interviews, whatever, tombstones, old findings on pergament. It is always via the written, spoken, or image, language, how we can access what has happened and what people believe about what has happened and how they frame those events. So historians have recently become very conscious of our work. For a long time, historians really had no critical approach to the sources. Yeah, they just took it as a given. But due to interdisciplinary exchange, historians have become very much aware of the symbolic functions of language and communication, and have started to challenge the written and spoken words a bit more, so that we have come to work together in very good ways, which has been very fruitful for our studies. So the key questions which I want to ask during this lecture, and of course which I will not be able to answer all of them, but just to give you a kind of notion in which way we use and guide our studying. First of all, which narratives inform and constitute national identities? Which myths are present in nation states, but also in families, but also in institutions? They all have this history and some kind of founding myths. And it's important to ask which functions do they fulfill. So there are myths about heroes, about victims, the question, who are the victims? Why are the victims? Why is this such an important event? That is, of course, you have to ask these questions. Secondly, we focus on different social actors. And in every sort of difficult event in the past, there are very different functions those social actors might have had. They can be victims, they can be perpetrators, they can be bystanders. They might know, they might not know, or they might claim not to know. So it's important to look at the roles of these social actors, how they are predicated, how this is justified, and so forth, and to ask how they remember the traumatic past. And you might get very different narratives and perspectives from different social actors about the same event. We also have to ask, are the perpetrators mentioned and named? Because there's very frequently silence about that. Things just happened, and it's not talked about who did it. Yeah. Because of different reasons. Yeah, very different reasons. Then are there diverging narratives? Do they persist and coexist in parallel? Is there still a struggle about this identity narrative? Which events are emphasized, which are silenced, and why? And how is what I call post hoc coherence constructed, in the sense of how do we construct post hoc a coherent narrative, although things happen simultaneously, abruptly, or subsequently, but suddenly we have very nice narratives which make much sense. So how does that happen? So these are some of the questions which we posed to our research, which I think are important, both in families, but also in bigger collectives, in groups, and which might change during a longer period of time, yeah, with different generations. So to briefly talk about the Austrian context, I don't want to take too much time with this, but it's important to contextualize the data. As you might all know or have already mentioned, that Austria was the so-called first victim of Nazi Germany. I say so-called because they opened the borders, they didn't resist, and they welcomed Hitler on the very famous Heldenplatz in the center of Vienna, 100,000 of people. And so there's actually no way you could talk about victimization. Yeah, there were victims, of course, immediately, because there had been very many illegal Nazis already for a long time. And those victims were political opponents, because the left-wing parties had been already underground since 1934, where the Austrian fascist government took place, and immediately all left-wing parties were forbidden. So political opponents were immediately imprisoned, already sent to concentration camps. Jews, Roma, Sinti, homosexuals, and other gay people, all kinds of sexual identities, and everybody who was physically challenged were immediately victims. And they were immediately after the so-called Anschluss on March 12, 1938, there were immediately riots on the street, and Nazis beat up people, and there were very many suicides. People just jumped out of the windows because they knew they had absolutely no chance of escaping. And these first days of the Nazi regime in Austria are usually described as absolutely horrific, even worse than in Nazi Germany, because there was such a strong, explicit anti-Semitism, which had been around for centuries, but also for the last decades, so that Jews were immediately beaten up. They had to wash the streets. Their possessions were Aryanized. So that happened all very quickly. So after 1945, there was this myth about the first victim, and then there was silence. I will come back to this for a long time, until 1986. Different than in Germany, where the challenge of the past started 68. In Austria, it started 86. Interesting here. And that was because Kurt Waldheim had been the General Secretary of the United Nations, and he stood as candidate for president in 1986. And during the campaign, it was discovered that he had lied about his Nazi past. by investigative journalists. And that became a huge affair where a lot of international media joined in, and that became a huge national scandal, and immediately also triggered a lot of anti-Semitism because the World Jewish Congress and many other societies started investigating the past of this guy who had been, and that's quite interesting, the translator of General Löhr, who had SS guy who was in charge of the soldiers and the Nazi army in Greece, and specifically in Thessalonica. And we know that, about 200,000 Jews were deported from there. And he claimed that he didn't know what happened, he only translated. So that's interesting that you don't know what you translate. I guess the translators of this lecture, I do hope that they understand what I'm talking about here. Exactly at the same time, Jörg Haider was elected chairman and leader of the Austrian Freedom Party, far-right populist party, and that started actually the far-right populist movement in Central Europe, but also in large parts of Europe. We talk of a Haiderization of Europe. Berlusconi followed, Le Pen, etc. And so this year, 1986, is a salient year. And interestingly, this Waldheim affair really split the society for and against. He won the election, but ever since there was no way of silencing anymore. And that led to a, one could say, quote unquote, very healthy reflection of the Austrian past. I jumped to 1991, where the Social Democratic Chancellor Vranitzky gave a speech in Parliament, which was the first time the Austrian perpetrators were mentioned, and it was acknowledged that many Austrians had been part of the Nazi Party and of the extermination machinery in the Holocaust. And then came the first really, or second really big intervention, and that was an exhibition with videos and images on the Nazi army, the German Wehrmacht, and they had, that was also a myth, you know, it was only Hitler and his friends and immediate followers, but everybody else was innocent. Yeah, they had just had to do their duty. It turned out through this exhibition, which was shocking for the German and Austrian public, that very many Wehrmacht soldiers had been part and parcel of the extermination machinery, and that they had shot hundreds of thousands of people in the war in the East, in the Soviet Union, but also in Poland and Hungary and so forth. And that wasn't their duty. They just did it. And so that myth was also destroyed. Yeah, and of course, in almost every family, there was somebody who had been part of the Wehrmacht. I remember students coming to me with the sort of pass of the soldier of the grandfather and saying, you know, but he couldn't have been a Nazi. And I said, I don't know, you know, it's not for me to know, but he was part of the Wehrmacht. And, you know, the Wehrmacht as army and institution has done a lot of and has been part of a lot of horrible war crimes. And only in 2014, finally, defectors were rehabilitated. Up to that time, the deserters of the army were still regarded as bad, evil. They had not done their duty. Finally, it was acknowledged that they had actually defected from a criminal army. And the first memorial was disclosed. So it took a long time, yeah? And in 2015, finally silence was lifted from the final phase where war crimes had been committed. And that was after May 8, 1945, which was the end of World War II. There were still fighting went on, and some SS men or Wehrmacht soldiers still killed people, but also in the villages, sort of normal citizens also still killed homosexuals and Jews and Roma. Yeah. So there was kind of a transition phase. And of course, it wasn't the case that the war is over, everything changed. Yeah. There is transition phases, and those can take quite a long time. Yeah. Austria joined, of course, the EU 1995. So if we have commemorations, we usually commemorate 1945, 1955, when the Allied forces left Austria, 1995 with EU membership, and then we have, of course, been part of all the global crises which are ongoing. We can add now the Ukraine war, the first war in Europe, which is so close again. There was the Yugoslavian wars in the 1990s. There was the fall of the Iron Curtain. So there's lots of global events, which of course also related to politics in Austria. So the constitutive founding myths of the Second Republic, I already mentioned the victim myth, very important. And they refer to the so-called Moscow Declaration 1943, where Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill met. And they launched a declaration where they said Austria had been the first victim of Nazi Germany. And usually the second part is not talked about, but there is a second part of this Moscow Declaration, which says but there were Austrian perpetrators and they have to take responsibility. But that is usually swept under the carpet. Yeah, so there is a sort of denial about this. Then the myth of the 0 hour, we just talked about this, 1945, everything changed. Yeah, suddenly there were only good Austrians and good Republicans, and that had been a nightmare, but that was over. And of course, that wasn't the case. Yeah, there was a transition phase, there was denazification. 700,000 Austrians had been part of the Nazi Party, which is about 10% of the population at that time, or a bit more even. And you can't what do you do with these people? You cannot imprison all of them. I guess you had similar issues, yeah? And I know about South Africa and Chile, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We didn't have anything interesting like that at all. There was denazification, and then different categories were established, yeah? Sort of big Nazis and those who were not responsible for so much, and those who had only known but not really done something. And yeah, so there were the Nuremberg trials where some of the leading Nazis were sentenced to death, amongst them quite a few Austrians. Eichmann was captured by the Mossad and then put to death in Israel. Hitler shot himself, but there were quite a few really leading Nazis who hid or who took the very famous rat trail, which the important book by Philip Sands is about, over the Vatican to South America. And so, as we know, in Argentina, many of the Austrian high Nazis were hiding. Also Mengele, the infamous doctor in Auschwitz, but also others, and some of them have been found. Of course, some of them have died, but so this myth of the 0 hour has collapsed. Then there is a heroic myth about the reconstruction of Austria, which had been bombed seriously by the Allies. And there's a myth about the women, because the men had all been at war. So the rebuilding was done by women a lot. And suddenly many of these women who had also been Nazis, of course, were suddenly mythologized as those women who rebuilt Austria. In fact, they were forced to rebuild by the American and Soviet armies who were in Austria, and they had to work, and the men were either dead or imprisoned in the American or Soviet prisons, and or came back. So again, we have another myth, this time relating to the women. And the fourth important myth was what I have already said, and which has collapsed, about the innocent army. The Wehrmacht, which just had to do their duty. So I come to my data, and I will say a bit about those projects. You can read about them. All of them have been published also in books by the various teams we've worked with. We have some eyewitness testimonials, basically via the Wehrmacht exhibition, where the filmmaker Ruth Beckerman interviewed visitors of the exhibition and confronted them with those horrific images. And there were some old soldiers amongst them. And so we've got eyewitness testimonials. Also, another historical project did oral interviews with a lot of people in various villages, how they had survived and how they had perceived and experienced the war, and also the deportation of some of the co-citizens. Then we have done interviews in a project with my generation, basically, those born after the war, but whose parents had been refugees or had been imprisoned in concentration camps and survived, or who had fought with the Allied forces, with the Americans or British or Soviet or Yugoslav partisans, or in the Spanish war, civil war, and the families had come back to Austria. And so we were able to interview quite a big sample of the children of those survivors. And then in focus groups, we had grandchildren. We had the third and fourth generation in schools, but also in the families of the second generation. So we were able to interview some of the children of those grandchildren of those survivors. So that comes a bit closer to Mariana's work as well. And in that way, we have those intergenerational narratives We had projects about this big intervention with the Wehrmacht exhibition, projects about the second generation, and also projects about the construction of Austrian national identities over 20 years. So at 3 points of commemoration, 1995, 2005, and 2015. So we were able to have a longitudinal comparison. I just talk a bit about some of the strategies which I find important. As I said, legitimation, denial, and distancing. So there are different kinds of disclaimers and denials. Teun van Dijk has written a lot about these disclaimers. Yeah, actually I didn't want to, but I did, or my best friends are, but, and so forth. And there are different kinds of denials in the sense of I did not do it. Yeah, I don't know anything. It was a mishap, control, I had to do it. Yeah, this fulfilling one's duty. I had no intention of doing that. Yeah, I did not mean it, but it, it just happened. And I didn't want to achieve this goal. Yeah, I did not say this because I did want to kill them, but and so forth. So you can analyze all these interesting denials in different ways, which introduce usually a story. Yeah. So the frame can be a different kind of denial, and that is frequently used to legitimize what happened afterwards. Then you find the weakening, downplaying, minimizing of one's own actions. You find a lot of euphemisms and metaphors, yeah, kind of trying to cloak what really happened. You find the victim-perpetrator reversal. The others are to blame, so that is a very frequent strategy. Then we find the equation, yeah? So it's not so bad because others do it as well, as if that has an effect, yeah? But that happens all the time, yeah? So even nowadays, if we talk about something a far-right politician says, the answer immediately would be, but somebody in France also says this. And then you can only say, and so what? Yeah? I mean, it's happening here. We're talking about what's happening here. But this is a very quick way of trying to distract from an accusation. And that's what I really think was one of the most important strategies which we found, the narrative veiling. Now, that means not only sort of denying, but actually sort of having a silence, cloaking whatever happened. So it's just not talked about. Yeah, it's not even I don't know or so forth. It's just as if it hadn't happened. Yeah, no, it's taboo. And that was particularly apparent what some of the first generation told us when they came back from concentration camps, and nobody was interested to know what had happened there. Yeah, they actually didn't want to know. Yeah, because they would have felt guilty or ashamed or something. So those survivors had no way of telling their stories. And some of them also didn't want to tell their stories because they were so terrible and they wanted to forget, or they didn't want their children to know. Yeah, they wanted to kind of keep the kids away from these horrific experiences. So there were different motives, yeah? But we had this silence. Yeah, nobody talked about it. So to give you an example from, I mentioned some social scientists who who wrote a book about the Austrian memory and remembrance, second edition, 2016. And they had interviewed people in various regions and small villages, what they remembered. Yeah. And so we translated that. So there's this woman, anonymized, of course, Lisbeth, who says she remembers a secondhand impression. That was after this Reichskristallnacht. That was the night on 9th November when all synagogues in Germany and Austria were set to fire. And very many Jews were tortured and killed by masses, yeah, just people on the street, and sort of the Gestapo and the SS, and and the Reichskristallnacht. The name comes from the destruction of shop windows. Yeah, Kristall is crystal. And so the shop windows of Jewish shops were destroyed with stones, and the shattering, yeah, that was kind of caught in this name. It was the name the Nazis called it, so the research calls it November pogrom. Yeah, we don't use that word in research. But of course, this woman just talks about it the way she perceived it. Was that in November 38? Anyway, the synagogue was burning in her town. No one from our family was there or in any way involved. So here you have the disclaimer immediately. But after the event, one said that the SA might have set fire to the synagogue, and an SA man might have put a straw wisp between the legs of a Jewish woman and set it on fire. And allegedly, all of this only from hearsay, allegedly Gauleiter, that was one of the hierarchies, Eigruber then immediately ordered the arrest of that man and had him expedited to the concentration camp Dachau. One felt that is proper that he went to Dachau because that's just something you don't do. Now, that's a very interesting narrative, yeah, because it's a legitimation and justification. She starts with the description and the impression of what happened at this November pogrom, immediately followed by a disclaimer, yeah, so she was not involved, her family, and then everything is in the conjunctive. So it might have happened, but it also might not have happened. Yeah. So she's actually challenging the facts because that happened. Yeah. And so she refers to somebody else who told the story. Yeah. So she's just retelling the story she heard from somebody else, whom that this guy might have set fire, and another man might have put a straw wisp between the legs of a Jewish woman, and allegedly, and then she again emphasizes that that might have just been a rumor, yeah, but she was there, yeah. So in post factum, she's trying to minimize it because she's ascribing a possibility, but not a factual evidence, yeah? And then she also says, but there were things you just didn't do, like setting fire to this woman, and that's why this guy was punished. Now, we all thought that was the first time we ever heard about these punishments, yeah? Because, of course, they were allowed to do everything, yeah? And torture Jews. And then she says one felt, so that is again sort of vagueness. It's not her, but one impersonalized, that is proper that he went to Dachau. That was one of the first concentration camps close to Munich, because that's just something you don't do. So suddenly there is a rule of, behavior, which obviously only is linked to this torturing of a Jewish woman, but to nothing else. So here you have one of those typical narratives full of euphemism, minimizations, denials, justifications, but you also have a terrible fact which is talked about in this sort of framing of it could have been, but it could have also not been, and that's just hearsay of what actually happened. And this is very typical, Ziegler and Canonier say in their book, for the narratives which they were able to get from various people they interviewed in these villages from the first generation. Then somebody who was a visitor in this exhibition about the war crimes of the Wehrmacht, and that was a former soldier, and we analyzed, we got all the videotapes and audio tapes from Ruth Beckermann's interviews. And this is now a soldier, a former soldier, who tries to again give us a completely minimized and euphemistic story. Yeah, he says, I do not regard the Wehrmacht as criminal. They acted like all other soldiers. Yeah, so all soldiers fulfill their duty, they do horrible things, but that's what they say, normal war. Yeah, most of the time better than the others. And about the Jews, well, if you ask me, I never even saw any. The only time I saw Jews, so he didn't see any, but he did see, there was a chain gang. They were from the concentration camp and they were unloading wood at the train station. So that means he was stationed somewhere in Poland, obviously, or in the Baltic states where there were concentration camps, and he saw Jews doing forced labor. And then the interviewer, she says, where was that? And then he says, that was near Gommel, Boris, somewhere in the middle section. Yeah, that's how you talk about these areas. Well, that was the only time. Yes, my God, no, Pinsk, that was an almost entirely Jewish city. So suddenly he has seen a lot of Jews. We went there because we then advanced through the Pribitz, and they're my people, because he was higher in the hierarchy. There were so terribly many watchmakers working there. So here come the Jewish stereotypes, yeah, the anti-Semitic stereotypes. Some of them had their wristwatches fixed there, and then he laughs. And you don't know what this laughter indicates. Yeah, because what does it mean they had their wristwatches fixed there? So they went to those watchmakers. What did actually happen? Yeah, they got that done in one night. So at least we know these people had to work for them very quickly. Then we moved on the next day. And the interviewer says, so the Jews were still there? And he says, yes, they were there as we got there and were there when we left. We were only there for about 12 hours in the place. So here you see all the contradictions which come up in this very brief narrative. Yeah, he never saw any, then he saw them, then they were in the concentration camp, then there was a whole village of Jews, then suddenly he remembers that they were watchmakers, but he's adamant that nobody got hurt. Yeah, so they were all there and they were there when they left. And they were actually a better army than most. So you see how this memory work, the processes work, how it's not coherent, yeah, because there are fragments which are attached to each other. And then a silence of the victims. I had already said that the victims also kept silent. And this is, again, anonymized. Gisela, in a book by a psychiatrist who I also worked with, named Dreams, Fights, and Life Trajectories. And she says, and she was in a concentration camp, but she also fought in the Spanish Civil War. She was a communist, and so she comes back. Yeah. My surroundings consisted of people who had been persecuted. So when she came back, the few acquaintances from earlier times that I met, they all emphasized that they had not done anything and were not Nazis. Once I went to see our old tenement house, because the people had been thrown out of their houses. The houses were Aryanized and claimed by the Aryan Austrians. Our old caretaker embraced me cheerily. How nice that you are back. Yeah. She complained that her husband, of whom I knew that he was a Nazi, had to do work clearing up rubble. On the side of the house, it still said Steinmetz. That was the name of her husband, Gisela Sauljud, which means dirty Jew. Yeah. To my question if she had not had time to wash that off, she said, I swear to you, I never even saw that. That was my first and last visit to that house. So you must imagine this woman comes back after 7 years or more, where she had been imprisoned, tortured, fought in exile. And the first thing this caretaker says, that her husband has to now work clearing up rubble, doesn't ask how she was. And then she denies that she ever saw the graffiti, which had been there for 7 years. So you understand that this was so shocking to Gisela that she never went back. And many people who came back told us similar things. They went to look for their house or apartment or wherever they had lived and were, of course, not welcomed, but not even let in or just sent away, or the people were very rude, so that they never went back to their old environment. The second generation has kept silent, and they interviewed their parents frequently, but the parents never told them much. And so when we interviewed the second generation, my generation, it's post-war generation, they all actually stressed, or almost all, that they almost knew nothing about what had happened to their parents because they didn't talk about it. So here are just some fragments. Keeping silent is not the right expression, but telling a lot neither. No longer to be able to tell the difference between one's own memory and what you've read and heard. It was a topic, but not only, but mostly in a very general form. The concrete story, I know very little. Our parents started very, very late to tell anything. From my father, I did not hear very much. My father was a very closed-off, silent, a very serious person. Hardly anything, also the telling. I knew practically nothing about my father. And then it was talked about a lot. With my father, that was very strong. He always presented it to us as if it was all adventures. And that was incredibly funny. So, as I had already said, you can frame these narratives also in a way that makes it maybe adequate to children. And if you've seen the film, the Italian film, which got the Oscar about the father and the son. Life is Beautiful. The father making jokes all the time. trying to accommodate this terrible happening to the little son. And that was quite frequent. Yeah, it was adventures. And they came across as heroes, yeah, who had survived and won these adventures. Or another one of those stories by Gregor, again anonymized. Out of the war, I knew my father had a visa to Brazil. He learned Portuguese, and then, as far as I know, he voluntarily said, no, he's not going there. But going out of the country, he went to Belgium. And what I want to stress here is that there is no time, but only spaces which are located. So the memory is about space, but not time. This having a safety net in a foreign country. My father's brother was already there, I think already in love with a Belgian woman. Well, my mother was in Spain, yes, a different country. She could not come back, but to Spain she also went from France. So we don't know, was that before or after or how? And she did not come from Austria, but she was already in France before that. I believe in 1935 she already went to France. She then went to Spain. Then she said that she actually wanted to come back to Vienna once more to convince her father to leave. But the Communist Party, so my mother told it, took away their passports in Spain. So we've got all these locations, but we've got no sense of time, yeah, except 1935, yeah? And so that narrative veil cloaks what happened where we just know spaces, locations, not what happened and not when something happened. So this is why I believe the chronotope, the Bakhtinian concept is important. And I guess most of you know some readings of Bakhtin, that the telling of events is deformed. So there's no coherence, or coherence is established post hoc. And there's a construction of meaning which must negotiate this time-space relationship. And as a social practice through which memories are scripted and shared. So we all have these mental maps of, space and time, and somehow the narratives have to fit in there. And what we did was we looked at all these narratives and we came to see something very interesting, that the temporal reference until 1938 was very much present, yeah, in 43 of our interviews. And then there was almost no time. And then suddenly, after the end of the war, people started talking again, where had they been 1945? Yeah. So we have this gap of 7 years where we only have locations, but we don't have time. And we also don't have agency. We don't have people doing something, but somehow they came from X to Y, and we don't know how. Yeah. And we don't also hear about the perpetrators. Somehow this happened. Yeah. And that's the way those stories were told. And again, if you look at days, weeks, months, all dates, you see that you have a lot of particular dates. And then again, 1938, we have this peak. We have a peak in 1945. We have a peak, probably this is the Hungarian Revolution, 1956, where a lot of refugees came to Austria. Then we have this huge peak with the Waldheim conflict and affair. And then again, we have very little temporal reference. So that shows us that the narratives, which are usually built around time, are suddenly built around space, which we found very interesting. So to summarize this, the generic narratives usually represent atrocities, which are very generic and not specific. Yeah, so they're retold. There are manifest and comment on the family dynamics. Yeah, this retelling, which every generation then also changes a bit. The veiling focuses on the narrator's epistemic uncertainty in remembering, what we just talked about, and the chronotope of timeless space. Yeah, deletes perpetrators and the day-to-day struggle of survival. And we frequently also found scenic narrations, sort of with direct and indirect speech, which actually was the only entry point to emotional trauma. And very interestingly, I can talk about this more in our discussion if somebody's interested. We found specific narratives with every interviewee where they started crying. And they retold that narrative in the same words if we asked them again. And that was really very revealing, because many of these people had stored all these terrible things and suppressed them and rationalized them, and they could talk about it, yeah, in those interviews. But at one point there was this, we called it tear narrative, yeah, where suddenly the emotions which had been enclosed found their way, and basically these stories condensed all the suffering of their parents. Yeah. And we were really struck. This was something we hadn't known about at all. Yeah. So I come to my almost final slides. The group discussion, we had focus groups in our national identity project, and the memories are really interesting also with the irony, as I already said at the beginning. So somebody in a group discussion said, we still worship our Habsburg monarchy, yeah, so making fun of the Austrians, even if that was, of course, a terrible, disgusting regime. And then he says that was ironic, is as if one wouldn't have understood anyway. I really believe this is still more important for our identity than the Second World War. So, which is probably true for the older generation, including the entire persecution of Jews, and also because it is more painful to us that we lost Czechoslovakia than having killed millions of other people. So he is very sarcastic, yeah? This is a 17-year-old school kid, yeah? And here I just want to show second generation. Haider was always very proud that he had been born post-war. His parents were Nazis. And here he was interviewed, and he talks about the Wehrmacht, and he uses all these euphemisms, yeah? Like we now hear from Putin about the special military operation. Now he talked about military campaigns, which was the occupation and the triggering of the Second World War by marching into Poland. And then he says, then we have to ask what really happened. And the interviewer says, do you consider the Nazi dictatorship a dictatorship like any other? And Haider says, I believe that one should not make gradual distinctions when talking about totalitarian systems. One should reject them altogether. And then he becomes very vague and abstract. There was an era of military conflicts in which our fathers were involved. At the same time, there were operations occurring within the framework that cannot be accepted. And then comes the disclaimer and denial, but no family members of mine were involved in the latter. The interviewer says, do I understand you correctly? Operations? What exactly do you call operations? Oh, well, activities and measures against parts of the population that were blatant human rights violations. Do you have any problems calling it genocide or mass murder? Either, if you like, then it was mass murder. Yeah? So he's only saying that because the interviewer requests it. Yeah, he doesn't really believe it. So you see a way of calculated ambivalence, yeah, of how you actually label things in different ways and euphemistic, deny that he knows what really happened, and what really happened were military conflicts and operations. One is really reminded of Putin's narratives about why he started the war in the Ukraine, yeah, where you cannot use the word war, you are put into prison, yeah. So you really think there's nothing new. It's all 1984. It's all Orwell, yeah. And now the third generation, again, focus groups, high school students. And then I also noted that Nazi Austria, well, how we were actually very much involved in the whole fascism thing. And yes, that we should not deny that. So they have gained a kind of distance. They're 17, and they're either making jokes or they do take over responsibility. And another guy says, well, I also find it important to say that, which we also discussed in history, that Austria was fascist before Germany as well. So we would not have needed Germany to be that. So they actually are quite blunt in their judgments. There is no denial, no disclaimers, and they're distant from the generation who was involved. Another one, but I never met anyone who said, when you said your grandparents had been resistance fighters, who would have said traitors or something like that? So those who had Nazis as grandparents were always 100 times more ashamed. So grandchildren of victims, who relate their experiences in Austrian schools and say that their colleagues were much more ashamed. Yeah, so it obviously takes at least 3 generations, yeah, at least, to come to such more responsible and factual utterances. So the challenges for a critical politics of the past, we could ask, are there lessons from the past? Well, not many. I mean, there could be, but it seems to be the case that many do not learn from the past. We should resist the downplaying and belittlement of past wrongs. We should actually call things by what they are and not euphemistically or, try to talk around it. We should avoid opportunistic success stories. They exist, but we should look at majorities. We should not use wrong, fallacious analogies. We should look at each context and analogies, inflationary use of some terms like concentration camp, Holocaust, etc. I mean, Holocaust is even used for animals or plants now, which is, I think, really a bad recontextualization. Avoid simplistic comparisons and dichotomies. I mean, there are so many there's so much complexity, yeah, which we should be aware of. And I guess there are many other possible challenges or results. And I want to close, I've talked enough, with some references. And I do hope you have many questions.
Well, thank you very much, Ruth. Thank you. This was very thought-provoking and a great introduction to the topic for those who don't know it, and also an example of the discourse historical approach to the study of memory and discourse. So thank you so much. We have, or I have a first question. I'm please inviting those who join us through YouTube to post your comments or questions. We have some people joining us from the university in Rivera, the border with Brazil and other parts of Uruguay. So my first question has to do also with the comments you were making at the end of the third generation. No, you said you had focus groups and that this newer, more distanced generations demonstrated more blunt judgments, and also they distinguished the possibility of children of victims of being more explicit about it, and for people who are relatives or related to the perpetrators, it was harder not to be. Here in the Southern Cone, in Argentina, in Chile, and now in Uruguay, there has been a group of relatives of perpetrators who are becoming public about the responsibility of their parents and grandparents in this crimes against human rights and crimes against humanity. And they've been very explicit. They have cultural products and also political manifestations expressing clearly that they don't agree with what was done. And also some of them have changed their names. They're called historias desobedientes, disobedient memories. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if there's something similar that has happened in Europe or in Austria. And what do you think about this type of movement? Right, and for those who are more directly connected to the perpetrators being explicit, like using the similar discursive strategies as the relatives or the third generation of relatives of victims.
Yes, there are quite a few examples of quite famous relatives, usually sons and daughters of the perpetrators. I don't know if I now memorize rightly, but I think of the guy who was in charge of one of the big camps, Frank, yeah, I think Auschwitz. His son distanced him, so he had various kids and wrote about it. Then there is this guy Wächter, who was in charge of the assassination of Dollfuss, who was the fascist leader in Austria, and then in charge of being the governor of Galicia, where they murdered millions. And his son, actually, I don't know if you read the book Ratline by Philip Sands, but this is an absolute fascinating, brilliant book where he describes how the son of this Wächter came to him and said he found the diary of his mother where she describes, how she was the wife of this regional governor and she had all these fancy clothes and fur coats and God knows what. And at the same time, she was in an area where the extermination camps were going on. And so Sands then starts to do research on this and involves the son. And then the son actually has to give consent to that being published. And so he describes this entire relationship also in this book. Yeah. So there are time and again sons and daughters who come forward, also in Germany, but not as a big project. Yeah. These are individual experiences where probably either they discover some sources or they can't live with the memories or something happens and they come forward. Maybe they also want some prominence. You don't know, yes, because then they're interviewed in television and they become prominent and then they are invited to talk shows and all of that, yeah? They write their memories, so you don't really know. But it's not part of a movement. Yeah.
And then in line with that, like the uses of the past in the present, which is something that you mentioned, that it's why it's important to continue studying this changes of collective memory or how we remember that past in the present. You mentioned that in Austria, you have seen a big shift from a period of silencing to, after the Haider affair, like a more open discussion, more visible recognition of that past. However, it seems that, as you mentioned, this populist right-wing movements have not disappeared, but continued vindicating their actions in the past. No, there hasn't been actually like a denial, or not. The denial doesn't exist anymore. It's like you've mentioned in other of your work that they're kind of being more vocal about vindicating their actions and legitimizing their actions. So how do you see the uses of the past in the present in other in the political sphere, in the public discourse?
Well, that's a huge question, a very good question. There are very different uses. On the one hand, the school books really changed, for example. Yeah, that was a very important move. As you know, the canon, yeah, if that changes, and the institutional transfer changes in schools and at universities, and curricula changes, that has a huge impact, because the history lessons were usually stopped after World War I, yeah, and then suddenly there was no time anymore for World War II. Suddenly now this has really changed, and children are taught differently, yeah, which doesn't say that they're always well taught, yeah, but at least the materials have changed, yeah, and there's lots of courses also for adults in various other institutions and so forth. So then what also changed is the media documentaries, which I think is very important. Of course, now traditional media and the state television has become much less important in relation to social media, but nevertheless, I mean, the official public has a lot of interesting documents. They interview eyewitnesses, they get testimonials, they have very interesting documentaries about different villages, what happened where, and there are groups of the different villages where citizens now start to do research on their own. So not a movement like what you described, but there are citizens civil society who say, okay, we now have to find out what really happened here, and they start doing research, and then they do memorials, or they have some kind of commemoration, or they renovate the Jewish cemetery, or something happens. Yeah, so I find that that is quite new. Yeah, since about 10, 15 years that happens. Then there is, of course, an argument, always this topos of history, which comes ever again with the far right. So the Austrians are very proud that they stopped the Turkish army twice. Yeah, from the Ottoman Empire. So they actually defended, the Occident. Yeah, and that was 1529 and 1683. Every school child in Austria hears those dates repeatedly. And then the argument goes, well, we defended the Occident already at that time. And that's against the Muslims. Yeah. We kept them out, and in that way we will save Austria again. So that is repeatedly used, and the far right, like Trump, but here in Austria that started much earlier. It's not only about making Austria great again, but it's also about saving Austria, from the invasion. And that is always used as this threat scenario, and there's absolute reference to the past. Yeah. Then there is also by the left wing sometimes a reference to Chamberlain and how that was wrong. Yeah. To try and negotiate with Nazis or fascists. You can't negotiate with them. You can't negotiate with terrorists. You have to, do what you think is right. So no appeasement politics. So that's also criticism directed towards the EU right now. Yeah, drawing on that historical event, because I think, watching that from here, what is happening in the EU Commission, they are very frightened of the EU elections next year to the European Parliament. The far right is rising. So what do? They install ever stricter migration and asylum policies. But that will not win them anybody. That will only win voters for the far right. Yeah, and we know that. Yeah, we always know that then voters go to the party which is authentically has always proposed these policies, not opportunistic shifts. Yeah. But again, you see this criticism, no appeasement politics. Yeah. So there are different instances where, always these references to the past are being drawn, and this motto, we should learn from the past, this Habermasian kind of ideal, where it's always said that, the others should learn from the past, but not we know. Yeah. I would be interested how this is in Uruguay.
Yeah, I think in Uruguay we have something similar to what's been happening in other parts of the world, that there's a more straightforward vindication of this past and trying to rewrite or focus on different events in the timeline, like for putting forth new dates or people who should be talked about, or crimes, right? Like shifting the narrative that had been established by historians and taught in schools, right? Like questioning that, like you were saying. But it's still used, and it's very relevant even today, right? Have a military party, or like that comes from people in the military who are kind of putting forth laws to try to liberate the people that had been put in prison for crimes against humanity during the dictatorship. They're trying to pass laws to let them be in home imprisonment and to say they are political prisoners. So there's a shift in the way that it's interpreted. But there's also this appeal, like now, this idea you were saying, even in the left discourse, like you can't negotiate with fascists, or how do you appeal to that historical record to justify the present decisions in politics. That's used. Also trying to talk about the influences of foreigners and the preventing, like defending the national identity, and all these foreign influences that are the ones that bring the bad ideas, right?
Yeah.
Like in the dictatorship, like the doctrine of national security, that's still an argument that it's being used nowadays. So yeah, I think that your work is very illuminating in thinking about how we talk about it and study discourses about the past in Uruguay in the present. What we've seen in studying in public discourse, for example, in the newspapers, is that what you were talking about, that there's no direct responsibility that's being attributed. So there's a lot of impersonal usage, and they just say never again, but why, or who's responsible for what happened. No, all the parties, all the newspapers promote this discourse of the dictatorship was negative in general, but there's no actual explicit mentioning of why it was negative, or who's responsible for the bad things that happened. And that's circulating a lot. However, the alternative right and more conservative newspapers are bringing in the idea that maybe it was necessary and it was justified because of all the disturbances and the foreign, like the guerrilla movements and the terrorists from left-wing and uprisings from students, and the unions were creating too much chaos. So that's coming back. It's being put into circulation, but it's not dominant yet.
Yeah, we also know that sort of the end justifies the means, and that's quite interesting now with the activities of the climate activists, who glue themselves on streets and stop the whole the morning shuttles and so forth, or who spray pictures and so forth. So they're suddenly named as climate terrorists. And if you then say, what do you want to imply with such namings? Because obviously terrorists are something else. But the left wing is, by these parties and such actors, are usually, they're not left, but extreme left. And they're very quickly communists, and they're very quickly terrorists. So these labels are used in a very discriminatory way. And then if really a terrorist attack happens somewhere, they don't find any words to use, because they have already used these words for these young school kids which have sprayed pictures. So in some ways, if it wouldn't be so terrible, it's quite funny, actually, and very absurd.
Yeah, I think that criminalization of protest, different forms of civil disobedience, right? That's kind of limiting the possibility of questioning the actions of the government or mainstream politics. And I think that's dangerous now in public discourse, how easily, like you said, it's demonized or labeled as deviant or not acceptable. this type of groups that now have different characteristics. It's not just political ideologies, but other causes.
Of course. Yeah.
And then there's some questions from Sara Perez from Argentina. She sends her regards, and she asks if she can comment about the situation in Argentina where the vice president elect, the new vice president, is. She says she's not a denial. No, she's not in one of the people that deny the terrorism, or she's not one of the people who could be labeled as denialists. However, she minimizes the dictatorship. She questions the term terrorism of state. And there are also laws that were questioning in parliament the idea of sanctioning the denial of terrorism of state, right? So like the punitive ways of managing this denial of the facts, right? Like you were saying, there are issues that are minimized in discourse in the way that people talk about them. However, we have a fact, something occurred that is also being proven, let's say. And so in Argentina, you have this tension of someone who was elected that promotes this questioning of the veracity and authenticity of how many victims there were, or if there was actually terrorism of state. And then on the other hand, the parliament was considering passing a law to ban and sanction, like in Spain and other places, where if you use certain terms, then you're punished.
Yeah. I think that we have to be very observant now what happens in Argentina, and that it would be very important for researchers there to cover it, and also to report. I mean, even if they don't write immediately a paper about it, but they could write blogs or, some kind of keep monitoring what is happening. That's because that relates to so much other research, and but of course every context is unique. So I think we really would be very, very important for us to know more about it, and not depend only on mainstream media who report what the government is actually launching.
Well, and one last question, just to in here for very long, so we're very thankful, and we're very thankful for the people interpreting.
Yes, very much so.
Last question, regarding more methodological things. You mentioned at the beginning that it was very important to work in teams, to think about this in like an interdisciplinary research that is focused on problems, right? And a problem-based thinking of research. And you also talked about something you found, that it was this emotional trauma and how it's retold and emerges in your interviews and in data, even making people cry at the moment where they're retelling the stories. So in thinking about the methodological aspects, I don't know, in your collaborations with psychologists and historians and other people, have you found ways to approach this type of interview that brings up a lot of trauma, right, in personal and family trauma? How do you deal with the situation per se? Like, how do you prepare as researchers to conduct this type of research that brings up this emotional trauma? And at the same time, how do you deal with the situation when the interviewee is crying or is being, and is there a follow-up, or do you have any suggestions? And then the other part is, how do you deal with your own with the effects it has on the team, right? The people researching, because it must be difficult to be hearing and processing, analyzing this type of data that is very touching, sensitive emotionally, but you're also part of that community, so it impacts you personally too. So how do you deal with this dual
Yeah, that
detachment? Yeah.
that both very important questions. I will start with the last one. So the self-reflection, I mean, we never did these interviews just one to one. We were always two people, yeah. Especially when we tried to elicit some of these traumatic experiences which were retold. And in that way, I was very lucky to have in the team this psychotherapist, psychiatrist who went with me to do these interviews. Yeah, so there was a professional present, although also involved, but somebody who knew at least how to deal with it. And we were afterwards, the two of us always went and had coffee and talked for at least an hour to kind of organize our thoughts about it. And the team itself, we had supervision once a month. But if needed, we could have had it more frequently sometimes by a coach, or I don't know how you call this profession, who talked with us, with the entire team, and how we cope with our traumas, and with our feelings about that, and with our emotions, especially frequently the anger, yeah, and the rage about it, yeah. So that was very interesting. And the other thing was the methodology, which you asked about, how we prepared. It was sometimes really impossible to prepare for these sort of tier narratives, because we never knew when they would come. Yeah, they came at totally unexpected points. Yeah, and we couldn't kind of organize our questions in a way that we knew now maybe this would elicit such a narrative. We couldn't do that. Yeah, so we could only go along as in such a very only organized biographical interview with some themes which we wanted to talk about, but not sort of, it wasn't standardized in any way, just the topics. Yeah. And if somebody really was so emotional or started to cry, we just had a break. Yeah. And we said, shall we all have a cup of coffee, or we can also turn off the tape recorder, sort of really react in a way which we thought it would be adequate for this person. And they reacted very differently. There were some who said, yes, I need a break now. I need to, drink a glass of water, go out of the room or something. And others who said, let's just continue. So you have to be quite spontaneous. And it was good to have a professional on site, yeah, and we did talk to them again, yeah, but not in as part of the design. We told them they could call us and we can talk with them, and then of course we talked with them what we could publish about it, and they could revise and read through the transcripts and say what they didn't want to have published, and so forth. So we gave them a lot of agency.
Great, thank you. We have one last question from Amanda Munoz, who says that she would like to ask about the impact of the research. If you found that your research about the recent past and the transmission of memory across generations and also the uses of the past in political discourse has had an impact in terms of the strategies used to counteract the denialists.
Yeah. Well, it had impact a lot. There was a lot of resonance in the media. So we were interviewed and the book was reviewed and all of that. Yeah. We were asked to talk in schools. That was important. We were asked to write short papers or just little articles for journals, not scholarly journals, but I don't think we had any impact on the political discussion. Yeah. I was invited by the Green Party and by the Social Democratic Party, and we talked, but they are not, I mean, they don't, Social Democrats are not in government, the Green Party is too small. So we can utter our criticism if we give lectures somewhere, which we do, but if they reach the people who they aim at, I don't know. Yeah. So I don't know if you have more impact.
Yeah, I don't think so either. It's very hard to change political discourse, but hopefully this work in Uruguay, the university has a strong line of work that tries to have involvement in the community. So hopefully we will be able to reach other.
That would be fantastic. Yeah.
So we thank you very much, Ruth, for all your time and for sharing your work with us. We hope that we can have a translation of your most recent book in Spanish, so we can continue using and learning from your work. And we'll invite you in the future to be able to continue the conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's wonderful to talk with you, and we have to continue our discussions. Absolutely.
So, we want to thank everyone who joined us through YouTube in the Spanish stream and in English. And also a very special thank you to the interpreters who did a wonderful job. First, the Federico Brum, the coordinator of the translation licenciatura, and Victoria Zavala, Celine Rueda, Ion Intrioni, Indira Alvarez, and Guillermo Gil. And a special thanks to Leroy Rodriguez, who managed all the transmission, the complexity.
Yeah, fantastic.
Everything. So thank you very much. And we'll see you hopefully next year again.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Ciao, ciao.